Why is cruising being treated differently to other travel? And is it being treated unfairly or not? I'm Gary Bembridge, and I have been thinking about and looking at these questions for many months now. As a major cruise fan, where I ended up may though actually come as a surprise to some of you. First off, let's be really clear, and I want to discard one kind of myth and make a point that I do believe in very strongly that does still set all of this up. People flying around the world with few restrictions and little controls, other than I guess in Australia and New Zealand, were undoubtedly the main culprit spreading this really infectious virus all around the world. It's not cruising and cruises. The real big issue, in my view, is that the restrictions, the precautions on flying, driving, going by train to cross borders between countries, they were too lax. So while cruising was shuttered to stop transmission and stop spread, other travel forms, of course, were not. Getting it wrong on flying and the other forms of travel and letting people go on land-based vacations does not necessarily mean that the approach on cruising has been totally wrong. Now, as I discuss during this episode, I think you're going to find that not only to believe that it wasn't necessarily wrong, but I believe it's actually going to benefit cruising in the short, medium, and the long term. Now, first of all, the reality is that the majority of cruise passengers are those who've been shown to be the most vulnerable at getting seriously ill, ending up in hospital, and dying from COVID. That is just kind of a fact. So although the average age of cruisers, according to Clear anyway, is 46.7 years, it actually hides the actual split. Who's really cruising, and it hides the reality that most cruisers are actually on an older spectrum. Way over half of passengers who go cruising are over 50 years, and they only account for about a third of the population in countries like the US, the UK, and so on. So over half are over 50. 33%, so a third of passengers are actually 60 years or older. And the biggest passenger age group in total is the ages 60 to 69. Now, 8 out of 10 deaths from COVID were by people over the age of 50 to date. That's according to the US CDC. Once you get under that age, the risk of hospitalization and dying falls really dramatically. Even early on, before the shutdown, there were proposals put forward by Clear, for example, to kind of put restrictions on people over 70 cruising. And even people like me in my 60s, there was lots of talk about having to get medical certificates and so on to cruise. The US and UK issued advice against older people cruising because of the risk of what happens if older people contract COVID. The age of travelers, I guess, on flights, land-based vacations is going to be much broader than it is on cruising, probably also even younger, certainly as an average and overall. Now, we don't all necessarily like the outcome and implication, I guess, but I guess we can see, if we're thinking about it logically, why governments have taken a conservative view on cruising with that older profile overall, because they have a duty. They felt they needed to protect people over 50, 60, 70, 80, and so on, and they've done that on land. You know, as the pandemic emerged, many of those age groups had to shield completely, and they are the priority for having vaccines. Now, ironically, this approach, this protection, could also be a way of aiding an accelerated opening for cruising as we head through this year, because those very same people that they're trying to protect are also the ones that are going to be vaccinated early. And by summer, pretty much everyone in those age groups everywhere will have been vaccinated. We've seen vaccination of this age group helping lines that cater for older travelers like Saga, American Steamboat, Victory. They're requiring vaccines because they can open with an older age group. It's exciting the European river cruise people. Secondly, the next major factor for taking a stricter approach, which I think is probably understandable on some levels, is cruises are a social experience. They're where people mix in numbers. They go dining, we go to bars, we go to the theatre, we go gambling, we go to deck parties, we go to nightclubs, we go on group excursions. All of those social things that we have learned are perfect for spreading the virus, whether it's at land or at sea. They are an issue. It's not just a sea-related thing. Social contact is the big risk, and social contact is exactly what cruising is. We go on vacation, we go on cruises to engage, we go on to interact, we go to meet people. Now, bearing in mind, most of those activities that we do in the day and the night on a cruise are the very same ones that have been shut down on land, but they are integral to the cruise experience. We know we're asking governments to open cruises which have all the things that they've closed, or have severe controls on land. So there's no theatres open, there's no nightclubs. In many places you can't dine inside, attractions are closed. Other than, I guess, Vegas, casinos are closed in many places. So all those kind of social things that we do on a cruise are closed down or very restricted. So I don't fully agree that you can compare going flying or on a train to cruising. They're not as social, they're not as mixing events like cruising, and they don't involve, a week of interacting. When we're flying or going on a train, we're mostly sitting facing one way, we're getting from A to B, there's not a lot of mixing. Of course, at the airport and boarding, there are probably some issues that need to be addressed. So, of course, again, I do believe, though, that this has played to the line's advantage eventually, because they put themselves in a really strong position versus land-based social places to reopen. So first of all, cruise lines have put in place phenomenal protocols that have been proven to work in practice. So we've seen MSC Cruises, Mein Schiff, Hapag-Lloyd. In Europe, we've seen Royal Caribbean and Dream Cruises in Singapore. They put together protocols which they've proven to work. And secondly, cruise lines can probably enforce much more than they can on land-based social events, because they can really require people to sign up before they're going to cruise. They can ensure compliance, and they have the ultimate lever. They can throw them off if people don't follow it. So they actually are in a really strong position to actually not only have strong protocols, but to enforce them. Another thing to consider about why cruise lines have been treated as they are is understanding why governments have taken that approach on cruising versus other transportation and vacation forms. And I think it is kind of interesting because there are two really big exceptions, Italy and Germany, which I think kind of prove the point about why cruising has been treated the way it's been treated. So let's have a look at it. First of all, airlines, train companies, even if you take Eurostar, for example, resorts, theme parks, they are of course big employers like cruise lines are overall, but they are incorporated, they have strong roots in the country, they're part of the infrastructure. Cruise lines are incorporated and registered in foreign tax and maritime havens. But the big exception in all of this is Italy and Germany. Those are the two countries that allowed cruising to resume right back in the summer of 2020, and they've been much more flexible with cruising. Why? It's not actually because they've got the virus in better control. Italy's been particularly challenging. But pretty much all of the world's cruise ships are actually built in Italy or Germany. Cruising is part of the country infrastructure, it's part of the strategic economy, and the governments therefore supported cruising and worked with cruising to return. The governments, they're invested emotionally, politically, economically in cruising in Italy and Germany, but not in UK, not in Spain, not in the US, not in Australia, and so on. So there's not been as much pressure, there's not been as much connection with the cruising as in those other countries. Governments just don't feel a need to work, they don't need to feel to open faster, unlike they do with airlines, which are integral. Cruising has also kind of fallen down while flying keeps going and trains keep going, because those are seen as essential to the running of the economy. Cruising, of course, is a 100% recreational travel. So governments won't close down flying, trains or ferries because they need those to keep the business going. They need people to go to and from their work. It brings in cargo, including things like PPE, vaccines. It's used to repatriate residents who are stranded abroad. It helps people to go to travel to care for people, medical treatment, visit people who are perhaps dying or whatever. Cruising doesn't have that lever to use. It faces very different standards because it's seen as a recreational setting. There's no strategic way, no angle that you can find to argue that cruising needs to keep going for the economy or anything like that. So it has different standards, it has higher thresholds, and that is the reality. But I think that, again, that helps cruising because they can increase the bar. Cruise ships, of course, are easy to track. They have to report. It's easy to know what happens. And this is why cruising has always been getting high attention and having higher standards. For example, ships have a reputation for being a hotbed of norovirus. But in fact, compared to land, the outbreaks are pretty low, but they're reported, they're recorded, and it's not so much the case on land. In schools, hospitals, restaurants, events, if there's a norovirus outbreak, it's not really reported, it's not the same. So think about Diamond Princess, Ruby Princess, and all those Holland America ships. And even when Sea Dream tried to start cruising the Caribbean, everyone knew exactly who was affected, how many affected, and where they were. On land, events on flights, there's very little data and very little contact tracing that really identifies in practice what's going on. So cruising's visible, it's an easy target. But on the positive side, I think this visibility could be a positive. You know, over 30,000 people were carried by MSC Cruises last year without any issues. More are being carried now. This means there's a lot of data, a lot of visibility that the cruise lines have around what's working. One reason for the stricter rules is the fear and the implications of outbreaks. Think of all those ships struggling to find somewhere to dock as the lockdown started when they had cases on them. Countries had to cope with managing all these people coming in, other countries then repatriating their people. There were fears of swamping local facilities with non-residents of the state or the country. Now this was a problem, it got in the way, but the issue has been addressed, and it will lead, and I think, lines to get out of where they are, because the protocols for the return have agreements now with local medical and transportation providers to care for and get people home. So that fear of what to do with people has been taken out of government's hands. It is something that the cruise lines are doing. Cruising has and is being held to different standard rules because it is different to flying, it is different to trains, it needs its own rules. The worst possible thing that could happen to cruising is to reopen and there be a major outbreak. It would hammer cruising for years. It would be absolutely just catastrophic. So opening cautiously, and the right has to be the way, not just charging in and saying, let us fly, let us train, let us do what they're doing. I've actually never seen any of the CEOs from the cruise line complain about how they're being judged versus flying. And if there's something I've missed, let me know. It's because they see cruising for what it is. It's unique, it's different, it's not like flying, it's not like a resort. It's a very unique situation and scenario. It needs its own rules. The CEOs keep talking about not being in a rush to open the right way, because as I said, the worst thing that could possibly happen is for there to be an outbreak. And we've seen that happen with land-based travel. What we've seen happen now is countries are locking down. They are banning flights coming in from countries. They're putting in hotel quarantining. They're putting in testing. So although airlines and cross-country train journeys were allowed, it didn't necessarily help them in the medium term. By having a different standards and treating cruising perhaps very harshly, I think is actually going to play into cruising's hands, because it's developed strong protocols, it's developed a strong set of standards, and it has a lot of visibility around it. What do you think? Have I got it completely wrong? Love to hear what you think. And remember, I have hundreds more of these Tips for Travelers episodes packed full of updates, tips and advice. So why don't you go and watch another one right now?